On May 22nd, 1980, the very first Pac-Man arcade machine was installed at a movie theater in Tokyo, Japan. Once people played it, they loved it. So with its nationwide release in July, the company that developed the game, Namco, decided to release the game worldwide. Executives thought that the name should be changed in the West because they feared that vandalizers would change the P into an F. Masaya Nakamura, who was president of Namco at the time, decided to change the character and game's name to Pac-Man for all countries including Japan. Namco was able to find a North American distributor. In North America, Pac-Man was distributed by Midway Games. In the early 1980s, Japan and North America had Pac-Man fever. Tons of merchandise was produced, and crappy home console ports were released. The game made a huge profit for both Namco and Midway Games, and with that came with many ripoffs and clones. For a time, Pac-Man was one of the most copied games on the planet. Many companies wanted to cash in on the game's success. One of those was General Computer Corporation, but to make this video simple, I'll be calling them GC. GC developed an enhanced kit for Pac-Man called Crazy Otto. It was your usual Pac-Man clone with Pac-Man inspired characters, but it had different mazes and hopping fruits. They thought that Crazy Otto would work well as a Pac-Man game, so they decided to present the completed project not to Namco, but Midway. Midway was getting very impatient with Namco to release their next Pac-Man game, Super Pac-Man, so Midway decided to buy the rights to Crazy Otto and worked with GC to turn it into an official Pac-Man sequel. Originally, Pac-Man was going to be the lead character in the game just like in the original, and was going to be Midway's own version of Super Pac-Man. However, seeing the first act in Crazy Otto, which showed Otto and his girlfriend falling in love with each other, they decided to make the lead character female. It made more sense, as since Pac-Man's creator, Toru Iwatani, created the original game to appeal to women. I think Iwatani must have said something like this.
How come all the
Arcade gamer.
others were guys? Not one girl! It isn't fair!
If Pac-Man was made to draw on women, then why not make the character in the sequel be a Pac-Woman? Pac-Woman didn't have a good ring to it, so they went with Miss Pac-Man. But after looking at the cutscenes, where it shows Pac-Man and her falling in love with each other and having a child, they went with Mrs. Pac-Man to reflect on that. But because it rolled off the tongue easier, they finally named the game not Miss or Mrs., but Miss Pac-Man. According to the game's programmer, Steve Golson, he claims that in the span of just 2 weeks, it went from Crazy Otto to Super Pac-Man to Miss Pac-Man. On February 3rd, 1982, Midway would release Miss Pac-Man in North America. Miss Pac-Man was a huge success. It was as big as the original Pac-Man.
Honey, don't you know I'm more than Pac-Man with a bow?
Midway owned the rights to the game and had to pay royalties to GC for technically creating the game. This was the first Pac-Man sequel unauthorized by Namco. However, Namco seemed to be okay with Miss Pac-Man, as not only was the game successful, but they were already familiar with Midway working on the game. Not only did Midway keep distributing official Pac-Man games to the West, like Super Pac-Man and Pac-Land, but they would also go on to create more unauthorized Pac-Man sequels. Pac-Man Plus is an expansion kit of the original Pac-Man game. Baby Pac-Man was an arcade/pinball hybrid. Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man was a pinball machine released by Midway's sidekick, Bally Manufacturing. Junior Pac-Man was a sequel to Miss Pac-Man. And lastly, there was Professor Pac-Man, an educational game for the arcade. I bet the last two were probably the biggest offenders for Namco when they found out Midway was making these games.
I should know, I'm the inventor.
You invented these things? I'm gonna sue you for everything you've got.
Namco would threaten a lawsuit against Midway Games for exceeding their license. As a result, both companies would end their distribution contract in 1984. However, Midway would still own the rights to Miss Pac-Man until 1987, when both Midway and GC, who were already in a legal battle over royalties, decided to give the rights to the game alongside Pac-Man Plus to Namco. Today, Midway Games no longer exists as a company. General Computer is still around, and Namco would be purchased by Bandai, and both companies would merge in 2006 as Bandai Namco Entertainment. After a 2008 court case, GC began to receive expensive royalties from Namco for most Miss Pac-Man re-releases in the form of arcade machines and plug-and-plays. This led to Bandai Namco slowing down the Miss Pac-Man re-releases, with the exceptions of free-to-play arcade machines, small arcades that are classified as toys, or home console ports to some extent. In 2019, a company known as AtGames acquired GC's as royalty interest. This meant that AtGames would be paid whenever the Ms. Pac-Man work is used commercially. The deal was completed sometime in August. AtGames is a company that gets a bad reputation, and for good reasons. They're basically the Jazzwares of microconsoles. Their Sega Genesis plug-and-play consoles before 2017 had terrible emulation, and their Bandai Namco Flashback Blast microconsole was nothing more than just a scam. Though to be fair, MSI Entertainment, another company that makes plug-and-plays, are equally as bad, if not worse. Anyways, AtGames learned that while some of the ongoing royalties for Ms. Pac-Man were being met by Bandai Namco, they were not meeting all the terms. After realizing that AtGames was seeking these rights for a possible mini arcade cabinet, Bandai Namco sued AtGames, claiming that they violated Namco's control of the license.
I'm gonna sue you for everything you've got.
AtGames didn't acquire any control over the Ms. Pac-Man IP. They just have the rights to receive royalties whenever it was used commercially. Right now, Bandai Namco's relationship with AtGames is currently in a bit of a pickle. The lawsuit over Ms. Pac-Man was only half of the case Bandai Namco presented in its allegations of false advertising, unfair competition, and copyright infringement. Previously, AtGames released a microconsole called the Bandai Namco Flashback Blast in 2018. Bandai Namco claimed that it contained code that they didn't approve. It was also falsely advertised as a plug-and-play with arcade games, but the microconsole in reality only had NES versions of the arcade games. AtGames would eventually release an updated version with the actual arcade ROMs inside. Bandai Namco still owns the rights to Ms. Pac-Man and the character, and finding the game in its original arcade form is pretty easy. Most retro arcade places will likely have a Ms. Pac-Man somewhere in their collection. It was also re-released in the arcades twice. In 2000, a version was released that included Galaga. It also included Pac-Man as an Easter egg. Another version of the game was released in 2004 which included Galaga and Pac-Man, no longer an Easter egg. Finding the game on home consoles is also pretty easy to track down. Most Namco Museum compilations include Ms. Pac-Man. It was also re-released on the Xbox 360 as part of their Xbox Live Arcade series, and in 2004, the same year it was re-released in the arcades, Jakks Pacific released a Ms. Pac-Man plug-and-play which included a version of the game very close to the original, as well as a few other Namco titles. A mini version was released under the world's smallest brand, but that version was okay. But there's another small version released by Basic Fun under the Arcade Classics brand. Despite the legal issues and lawsuits involving the game, Ms. Pac-Man is one of the most iconic and well-received arcade games of all time. Some would argue that it's better than the original, and I have to agree with them. Personally, Ms. Pac-Man is one of my favorite games in the Pac-Man franchise, alongside the original Pac-Man, Pac-Mania, and Pac-Man World. Whatever happens to the future of this game, Ms. Pac-Man will still be loved by everyone and will remain a classic for a very, very long time. That's the end of the story. Thank you for watching.